Morning, guys. How we doing? I hope all is well. It's a beautiful sunny morning, and take advantage of that. Absorb it as much as you can. Now is the time. Luckily, it's spring, and everything is starting to flourish and thrive, which means we will be as well. Just a matter of time. Today's discussion will be on architecture, and I'm mostly going to go through the historical aspects of architecture and the importance of not only it as an art but also as a science, and the combination and the synthesis of the two. I decided to do this video in my car and away from the apartment and the environment within there. The kids are starting to get pretty restless throughout the apartment complex throughout the day. I don't blame them. So I'm doing this one in the self isolation of my car. So double isolation. So again, I mentioned architecture is a combination of art and science. So essentially, the science, as you well know, would be the engineering aspect, and then there are major processes that have to be, or purposes that have to be considered when a piece or of architecture or architecture is going up. Up meaning mostly erect, right? So we know architecture mostly as a formidable object that we come in place with and spatially around us. Anything that you see that is often a place of entry and exit with certain purposes, and those purposes are predominantly how does it function, what is its form, and what is its structure. That constitutes often architecture. Now, the art aspect of it is how can you make it symbolic, how can you make it aesthetically pleasing. So we'll look at some examples of where we see things that are very aesthetically pleasing that that behoove you to enter the space, enter the architecture for symbolic reasons. We'll see some obviously for biblical reasons with different cathedrals that have been constructed, as well as chateaus and such around the world. So real quick, I want to reiterate the three purposes. I'm looking around a lot because it's so interesting. As soon as I pull up and I start doing this video, like 3 people pull up, and they're all sitting in their vehicles, drinking their coffee, and looking at me, talking into the atmosphere and into the air when I'm actually talking to you all. So, I don't know. It's interesting. It's cool. It's different. It's like I have an audience, like you're all there vicariously living through some witty 85-year-old man drinking coffee. So, cool. Again, 3 purposes of architecture is form, function, and structure. And, with function, it's pretty self-explanatory on what that means, I would hope. How is that building being used? How is it being, how are the masses, or how are the individuals coming into the place? Obviously, we're thinking human entrance, right? Not animal entrance. Architecture isn't often designed for the wild, but there are some cases where architecture is designed for the wild. Um, for example, the new tunneling systems that they have, or the overpass bridge landscapes that they're building for animals on overpasses in Europe, where they can go over and cross the freeways and the interstates so that no animals get hit by vehicles, and vice versa. No one gets injured by hitting an animal. So most of it functions in a way where how does that building being used? The next is the form, and that's how does it look? How is it looking both, well, mostly externally, and that's where the art kind of comes in. We'll look at Frank Gehry, where many of his new inventions and his surfaces that you'll see on the exterior of his architecture, and even some geodesic domes that have been constructed, how well they're structured internally, but then also how they function aesthetically in their forms on the exterior. And then the last, of course, is structure, and that's simply how it stands up. That's the engineering. What is required, what different techniques are used to allow for that structure to stand up. So whenever we're talking about those three purposes, there's three things that are going to come into the physics of three things. Whenever it comes to physics, are going to come in hand, and that's compression, tension, and then also bending. So compression is obviously perpendicular pressure, compression, and how it comes down, and how the weight of more objects that are built up on top are distributed down into the earth or to the ground or to some infrastructure that's embedded in the earth. So anything that we see and that we're going to be talking about is how do we distribute the weight of everything that's up high, plus the elementals like the winds that are affecting that and preventing any of those structures from falling over. So what techniques and what materials are being used to distribute both the elementals as well as the compression. And then, of course, tension is the idea of like cantilever and tension, like how much tension is needed or how far can you expand a material without the tension breaking it off, all right? So tension is being able to expand something out, also known as tensile strength, expanding it out and then preventing it from breaking. So what can we do? What is done architecturally to allow those certain things to happen and to function? And the third is, bending is how can you curve something? How can you bend something so solid, right? How do you bend that piece of wood? How do you bend that stone? How do you get a curve in the architecture? Is it done modularly, piece by piece, meaning brick by brick, or is it done as one item that's been bent for that curve, right? So those are three design elements that have to be taken into consideration when it comes to the combination and the purposes of art and science for architecture. So we're going to look at dry masonry, we're going to look at post and beam, we're going to look at round arch vaults, and within round arch vaults we're going to talk about barrel vaults, groin vaults, and also arcades. And then we're going to talk about domes, pointed arch vaults, and briefly talk about wood frame, steel reinforced, and because I don't want the video to be too long, and I know you probably won't watch two videos, so I'm just going to do one. I don't blame you. We got things to do. But I'm going to have you dive into the new innovations and give you an opportunity for assessment and evaluation with a PowerPoint, which I'll put up on Blackboard. So you'll be required to do some assessment work whenever it comes to the new innovations, as well as some briefing over what I'm talking about here. I decided to be a bad cat today and got me some Krispy Kreme. So please forgive any burping or anything like that. Okay. So again, this is essentially going to be diving through the PowerPoint, which I'll have up on Blackboard. All right. So the first one I want to talk about is dry masonry, and dry masonry is essentially stacking on top of stone, stacked on top of stone without any kind of liquidous mortar or binder. It's just all dry. All right. That's what it means by dry, is that it's just dry stone on top of dry stone and just stacked to build the structures. And there's an image in Zimbabwe, the Great Zimbabwe, before 1450 of there's a diagram of aerial perspective of what these great walls look like and this great fortitude look like, and you can see that it's all dry masonry. It's just stone stacked on top of stone. Now, one thing that's very specific about stone stacked on top of stone is you find the stone that best fits, right? And then if it doesn't fit, then you dress it. That means that you cut it down. So that means it's been cut down to fit properly the overall structure that you're looking at, the overall curvature, the overall linear direction of that architecture. So again, that piece has been up since 1450, and you can see some of the stones with the images have fallen, but it's mostly still intact. So just a great example of dry masonry. All right. And then we'll move on to post and beam, also known as post and lintel. And the post would be the vertical, and then the lintel or the beam would be the horizontal. Right? So you have a wood beam that goes vertical, then you have a wood beam that goes horizontal, and then another wood beam that goes vertical up and down. That's a post and lintel, right? Or post and beam, right? And if you think about, or if you know, there's not an image of it on the PowerPoint, but whenever it comes, sorry about that, whenever it comes to the Stonehenge, for example, in Ireland, those are post and lintel systems done in an aesthetic, ritualistic way. It's art functioning as worship, right? Art functioning for the spirit. But it's still architecturally the same concept. That's a post and lintel system. Right. Most structures that you see that we like, for example, the buildings on campus are a combination of wood frame trusses as well as post and lintel system masonry walls that are post and lintel. Um, so there will be I-beams throughout the building, and then there will be, the structural roof, which would be the postal system, often the trusses and such. Not always, but mostly. All right. Now, one thing that needs to be considered is the compression that's coming down from the weight of the rest of the building on the post and lintel system. So, if you have a post and lintel system that is made of stone, your stone lint or your stone post can be any size. All right, but the lintel or the beam itself has to be a little shorter. And that's because rock or stone doesn't have a lot of really good tensile strength. So that's that tension that we're talking about. So when compression comes down, there's a diagram of it, figure 14.3 in the PowerPoint. When that weight comes down and compresses on that post or that beam, the stone gets weak the longer the stone beam is, and it can crack in half, and your whole structure will fall. So it has to be a little shorter. Versus wood beams, have really great give and take, and they have really great tensile strength, so they can flex a little bit. But stone can't really flex. As soon as it starts to flex, it breaks or it cracks. Same thing happens with clay. Clay doesn't have a lot of good tensile strength, but it has great compression strength. It's just the way the molecules of the materials line up. So with wood, because of the fibrous nature, it can flex, it can bend. So the weight can bend, like the moisture, it can make it bend, and then it will flex back into its place. So it can flex a little bit. So whenever it comes to the post or the beams on the wooden post and lintel system, it can expand the same length as the beams themselves that are going vertical up and down, right? But not the case with the stone. So just refer to that diagram. So whenever you have a post and lintel system and there's a series of columns on post and lintel, they're called colonnades. All right, there's a really great example of that, the Temple of Amenmut Korsu, right? Or it's the court of Amenhotep II, all right, or the third. Sorry. So we're looking at 18th dynasty area here, and the Greeks really really expanded on the use of the columns and the postal systems. They mostly would use marble for their beams or their lintels. So again, the colonnades would be very tight, meaning that the columns would be very close to one another. Because again, like I just said, the stone lintels can't expand to be too long, or they will crack because of the molecular nature of the material. And the Greeks really expanded and elaborated on this, just like the Romans elaborated on the use of the dome. And also the Romans elaborated on the use of the arcade, which we'll talk about, which is an arch with the columns, and we'll see that in the aqueducts. And the Greeks used three main kind of columns for decoration for aesthetic purposes. There's the Doric, Ionic, and also the Corinthian. So I don't believe that's discussed in the PowerPoint, but it's definitely something to look at. Man, people are just showing up and hanging out in the parking lot and just chilling out. That's cool. Nobody wants to be stuck inside, especially on a day like today. But it's like go to the park and walk, take your coffee. Anyway, all right. So colonnade is a series of post and lintel system with the use of the column as well as the postal system or the lintel system on top. All right. Now we're going to look at vaults, arches, and your round arch is the first one I want you to take a look at. And this is a way to start getting that curve or that bend, all right, in the structure. So having doorways. Now, what we start to see with the use of the round arch being used above ground for the first time whenever it comes to the Romans. The Romans were the first to take this concept that was often used underground, especially like in catacombs and tunnels underground, is now being used above ground for architectural structures and creating corridors and channels and pathways throughout a structure above ground versus before it was all underground. Now, one thing that I really want you to take a look at, first of all, with the round arch diagram is the keystone. This is where the word keystone comes from, and it's the most important piece of stone or brick, or stone in this case, to keep the arch together. You build up, the diagram is actually what's called a sprung arch, which is it's very linear and vertical, and then it starts to curve up on the top, versus a cantilever or a catenary arch, which would start with the arch right away at the ground and then move its way and continue kind of like a rainbow all the way to the other end. So this is kind of a sprung system, the round arch, and that keystone is the last stone that's put into place. And that keystone locks the whole thing together and allows for the compression on the arch with any weight that's on top of it to disseminate down to the vertical sides of the arch and then down into the ground. Right? And then if you have a round arch and you extend multiple layers of round arch side by side, it becomes what's called a barrel vault. And there's a diagram of that at 14.6. And so that barrel vault is obviously a tunnel, right? A tunnel above ground. So it starts to create these corridors and these different places of movement throughout the space. So again, multiple round arches combined side by side adjacent to one another creates a barrel vault. And again, there's still a keystone that runs down the center of that barrel vault to keep it all together. If one keystone is off, the whole thing could collapse. We build kilns and ceramics this way, using these two different techniques, the sprung arch technique as well as this catenary technique. There are other techniques as well, but these are the most common and the most structurally sound. All right, so now I mentioned that the Romans were the first to bring it up above ground, which is cool. And then there's the groin vault as well, which is a combination of a few short-lived barrel vaults that combine to create this kind of Cartesian coordinate plane, this X and Y graph. And you can see the extension in the diagram of the top of multiple stones and multiple keystones interlocking, but then the side walls themselves are just one linear form. Right? And then there's the arcade. So talking about the arcade, which is a combination of the columns as well as the round arch shape. And this is an aesthetic choice that was used inside of a lot of cathedrals and a lot of structures, but then also for functioning purposes, for example, with Roman construction, where they started carrying water via the aqueducts. So if you look at the Pont du Gard in France, this is limestone that's being used with that arcade-like structure. Where you can see they're moving the water sources, and so these are some of the first forms of plumbing that we see. All right, so that's arcade. I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm going to touch on just a few more things, and then I'll have you do the research on the rest. So some more traditional materials we're looking at is with the dome, and the dome is a hemispherical vault, all right? So instead of just an arch vault, we have a full hemispherical vault. And then this is equal distributions all the way around 360 degrees. That's the use of the dome and the importance of the dome. And the dome can sit on a simple cylinder-like structure to disseminate the pressure and the compression throughout the whole space, 360 degrees, or it can sit on what's called the penitentives. All right, penitentives are often seen and used inside of a lot of Gothic and old cathedrals. All right, kind of gives it a little aesthetic feel to it, but still it has that equal distribution and flexibility that you see whenever it comes to attaching the dome that's directly on top. And then there's a really good example of it when visit the Byzantine Cathedral in Turkey, the Hagia Sophia. So that was in the 532 to 35 Common Era, right? So that's when it was built. It took those 3 years to construct, and you can see the dome structure on the top, but then also you have almost this opened umbrella-like appearance, and that is those are the penitentives, all right, that are distributing the weight of the dome down. So the weight of the dome is distributed amongst all the different penitentives, meaning there are 5, right? So penitent means 5. And then those 5 legs of the umbrella-like shape are distributed down onto the ground. Right? Then there's the pointed arch, which was often seen in the medieval times or the Gothic times, where we see the use of the pointed arch. Now the thing is with the pointed arch is you lose a lot of structure, or you lose a lot of structural integrity. So with these large cathedrals during the Gothic time, these Gothic cathedrals, it gives us this really beautiful ambient space inside, but there is no keystone. So the keystone is not there, so that means that the weight of the structure around it will actually collapse at that point of convergence in the center where there is no keystone. All right, so it gives it incredible ambience, but structurally it's not very sound. So what the architects have to do is they build what are called flying buttresses, and these are external buttresses that are on the outside of the cathedrals to disseminate the weight and to go back down towards the ground. All right, so expanding off the sides, almost building these wings off of the side of the cathedrals to allow for that weight to equally distribute, so that they can build these tall, well, almost 100 feet tall pointed arch vaulted ceilings. Right, so you have to have those flying buttresses. Right, that's a very important term to know and to remember. All right, and then some of the more contemporary is you have your wood frame architectural structures, which is the use of wood, timber, and also trusses. Many of the homes that we see around are made of these trusses and these wood form frameworks. So go on and peruse through that information and take a look at it. A lot of it will look very, very familiar. And then we start getting into the industrial age, and we're using steel and reinforced concrete. So a lot of your skyscrapers that you see in the major downtown areas and cities around the world are obviously steel, reinforced steel that's being used to, or steel that's being used to create these structures, as well as reinforced concrete. So not only is there a steel infrastructure and an armature or a skeleton, but there's also, if there's cement that's being used to kind of expand the overall architecture of the building, it is reinforced with often cast iron rods inside of the concrete so that it can tensile out or have tension out without it compressing and cracking. Because again, if you would expand concrete out like you would extend your arm out and then put pressure on it, it would crack at the joint, right? But if you have reinforced steel or reinforced cast iron rods inside of that concrete, then it will withstand that compression and that tensile strength that's coming down on it, all right? So again, new innovations coming in the 1900s with the Industrial Revolution, and also welding starts to become prevalent because of the use of the oxyacetylene torch, which is used. So one thing is Frank Lloyd Wright's incredible reinforced concrete buildings. So looking at Frank Lloyd Wright is very essential. And with Frank Lloyd Wright is, I just want you to remember this, he's building with an awareness of the surroundings. So thinking about not only um, what is going on inside of the space, but how is the activities of the folks inside of the space reacting to the natural environment that is around it. All right, so external and internal is starting to play with the idea of the architecture. He's the first to use open planning. He's also estimated walls between rooms, or he eliminated walls between rooms. So he's keeping it open and airy and ambient. He placed windows in corners, which is not common, and then also sliding glass doors inspired by Japanese screens. So you'll notice that sliding glass doors became very prominent and popular during this time. So what I want you to take a look at is the Kaufman residence at Bear Run in Pennsylvania, and take a look at that, and you can see that he's using that reinforced concrete to really cantilever it out, and that cantilevering is used for increasing tensile strength so that you can get that dynamic, sharp line and extension out into the environment, into space, almost like receptors grabbing out into nature and bringing the information back to the architecture, and then in that going inside and internally. All right. So look at Frank Lloyd Wright whenever it comes to reinforced concrete and the use of steel. And then after that, with recent innovations, I want you to take time and go through the PowerPoint and take a look at some of the new suspension structure techniques. Also really focus on Frank Gehry's museum, Guggenheim Museum. And I'll be asking you some assessment questions in regards to recent innovations, especially focusing on suspension and more structural techniques. Okay? All right, guys, take good care, and I'll be talking to you soon.